This was not the first time Jonah had heard a message from God. He was a prophet. That's what he did for a living. He heard messages from God and told the people. But this message was one like he'd never heard before, because God said to Jonah, "Go to Nineveh." Now, to say that Nineveh and Israel didn't get along is a bit of an understatement, because Nineveh was part of the Assyrian Empire, a historic enemy of Israel, and eventually they would go on to take them off into captivity. So Jonah could not expect a warm welcome. But this isn't where the story gets interesting. The story gets interesting when God finishes his sentence, because God says to Jonah, "Go into Nineveh, because their Ra'ath has come up before me." Now, popular translation of this word that you might find in your translation is that their wickedness has come up before me. And it's a possible way that you could translate that. It could be that he's sending Jonah there because it was a wicked city. And it was, there's no argument. But you could also translate Ra'ath as trouble. And I think that God was saying to him, "Go and preach in Nineveh, because their trouble has come up before me." I think that's what Jonah doesn't like to hear. Jonah would have been thrilled to go to the city and preach one final message of condemnation. But I think that the reason he runs is because he doesn't want to offer them mercy. So Nineveh was in the east, and Jonah decides that he's going to go as far west as possible, as far away from Nineveh as he possibly can. But it's not just Nineveh he runs from. He's running from Israel, and he's running from God. He hates Nineveh so much that he's willing to throw himself into exile. He's willing to give up his country that he loves and his God that he worships and go west. There's this conception in these days that the God that you worshipped was strongest in the area where the most worshipers were. So he probably thought that if he went west, he was actually literally running away from God. So he went and he bought his ticket, he got on the boat, and he went to sleep, and the boat sailed out. And while the boat was out there on the water, God sent a giant storm against this boat. And the sailors noticed this storm because it was so big, it was going to kill them. And they correctly guessed that the reason the storm was there was because some god was mad at them. And so they prayed to every god they knew. And for obvious reasons, it didn't work. And when that didn't work, they started grabbing all of their precious cargo and just chucking it overboard. And that didn't work. They couldn't get the ship light enough to overcome God's storm. And that's when they got the idea. There's a passenger that's not here. Somebody go run down below and wake this guy up, see if he can help. So one of the sailors runs down the ship, and he's probably being pitched back and forth on these stairs. And he gets down to Jonah and he says, "Wake up! There's a storm outside. We're gonna die. Pray to whatever God you have and see if we can fix this thing." The sailors didn't know which god was causing the storm, but they did have another idea. They thought, we might know what god it is, but we might be able to figure out who this unknown god is mad at. So they got out the lot and they passed it around, and Jonah rolled, and his roll came up guilty. And that's when the question started. They said, "Jonah, what do you do for a living again? Jonah, where are you from? Jonah, what ethnicity are you?" And Jonah said, "Well, I'm a Hebrew. I worship Yahweh, the God of the land and the sea." "You're running away from the God of the sea? On a boat? We're in the water here. Do you know what you've done? We're out here in the middle of a boat. We are in trouble. What can we do to appease this sea god?" Jonah thought to himself, "I've never thought of Yahweh as the sea god before, but I guess that's fair enough. And I guess he's the land god too, so I don't know what I thought what I was going to do when I got off on the dock. I'm sunk." He knew he was guilty. He knew that he couldn't run from God, that God was everywhere. And so he told the sailors, "Just throw me off. That's the way to appease Yahweh, the sea god." But the sailors, strangely enough to me at least, didn't just throw him off. If I would have been on that boat, he would have gone up just like the cargo. But these sailors, they had mercy on him, these Gentile sailors. They tried to row him back to shore. But God's storm was stronger than their oars. They tried to have mercy by rowing him back to shore, but God was going to have mercy by sending him back in a fish. So eventually, when these sailors figured out that they weren't going to be able to row hard enough, they prayed to God, and they said, God, we're new to this. We think you want us to throw your prophet off our ship. Please don't kill us for doing this. We're just doing what we think you want. And they threw him off. And when Jonah hit the water, the sea calmed, and the sailors celebrated. They had witnessed the raw power of God, and even more impressive than that, they had witnessed his mercy when he calmed the storm. But while the sailors were celebrating, Jonah was sinking. He was quickly losing air, and as he was drowning, he prayed out to God, and God rescued him in a way that he probably hadn't asked for specifically, but a giant fish came and swallowed him. God showed his mercy on Jonah. And while Jonah was in this giant fish, he prayed out to God, and he said, God, you saved my life. You heard my cry for help, and you sent this giant fish. You show your mercy to your followers. You don't show it to idolaters, but you showed it to me, and I will get to worship in your temple again. Thank you. That ship and that fish swam all the way to land, and it vomited Jonah up on the shore, just where he had started. And God had shown mercy to Jonah. Well, probably with the smell of the fish still on him, Jonah wasn't going to say no a second time to God. And his voice came, he said, Jonah, go to Nineveh and give them the message that I will give to you. And so he went. And when he got to Nineveh, he knew the drill. He was a prophet. It's what he did for a living. He knew that it was a 3-day city. It was such a big city that they had a whole process. The first day, he would go in, and they would offer him hospitality. They would give him a place to stay for the night. After a good night's sleep, he'd wake up, and he would do all of his official business. And then on the third day, they would send him off with a procession. But if you notice, when you look in your Bibles, it says it's a 3-day city, but that only mentions the first day. He didn't even wait to the second day because God gave him his message on day 1. Jonah shows up, and right there in the middle of the welcome wagon, they're taking his luggage, and God gives him the message. And it is a good one. Jonah is thrilled because God's message is turn or burn. And so Jonah shows up there and he says, 40 more days and this city will fall. Turn around or be destroyed. But what Jonah didn't know is even though the message was turn or burn, the city would turn. The whole city would turn. Matter of fact, it got all the way up to the king, and he sent out a decree. And the king said, everyone in this city, and I don't just mean people, I mean people and animals, sackcloth and ashes. No one eats or drinks anything. If you can think of any wicked thing you're doing, stop it. And maybe this God won't destroy us. The whole city repented, and God had mercy on Nineveh. Jonah was not pleased. He prayed out to God, and he prayed this angry prayer, and he said, God, this is why I didn't do this in the first place. This is why I put myself in self-imposed exile, because I know that you are the kind of God that gives mercy to people that don't deserve it. And God said back to Jonah, really? You're upset about me giving mercy to people that don't deserve it? But Jonah didn't get it. So Jonah left the city, still for some reason thinking that God would destroy it, and he went up to the east of the city. Now this is just a guess, but I think that he went up to the east of the city so that when the sun rose that day, he would have a nice view of the destruction of Nineveh. He wouldn't have the sun in his face, no glare. And so he built this booth for himself. And this booth didn't have anything for him on the ceiling. But as he's sitting there, God grows this vine up. And it's this big leafy vine, so it's coming up over this little shack that he's built for himself, and it provides shade. And he's probably thinking at this point, all right, God's coming around to see things my way. Not only is he going to destroy the city, I get a box seat for it. I've got some shade. And then the sun came up. And he had more to worry about than getting the glare in his eyes when the city was destroyed, because there would be no big show that day. When the sun came up, God sent a worm to destroy this plant, and it withered before Jonah's eyes. And that sun got higher and higher, and the city was no more destroyed than it had been in the morning, and it got hotter and hotter, and that seed in the east turned out to be a terrible idea, because God sent a scorching eastward wind, right in his face. And he cries out again to God, so angry. And he says, I am angry enough to die. I don't even have this plant anymore. And God responds to him, do you have a right to be angry about this plant? You didn't even plant it. But Jonah shoots right back and he says, yeah, I do have a right to be angry about the plant. I am so angry, I want to die. But God has the last word. He says, you're worried to death about a plant. I'm worried about Nineveh, a city of over 120,000 people that don't know their right hand from their left. Even the cattle in Nineveh are more important than that plant. Shouldn't I be worried about those? Now, I think that we can look at Jonah in this story and think, what a hypocritical idiot. I mean, he's a prophet. He does this professionally. His calling is to pass on the word of God. But he would rather send himself into exile or die than see God bring mercy on his enemies. And, I mean, this seems pretty far-fetched that someone would be this bad. It even seems stranger to me than the fish. But I've actually seen this tendency. I've seen this tendency in other people, and I've seen this tendency in myself. And I wonder if this tendency might be in you too. This Jonah complex I've seen in other people. Once when I was an outreach director, there was a low-income apartment complex right behind our church, and no one in the whole complex attended the church. And when I went down there to visit, I found that very few people attended any church. And I went down there and I talked to the people, asked how the church could serve them, asked if they were interested in coming by someday. And then I went back and gave my report to the church. But after I gave that report, several people came up to me and said, Dustin, I know you're new here. You may not understand the kinds of people that live in that apartment complex. You know, I can give you directions to good parts of town, and you can go do your work there, and it would really be appreciated. What they were saying to me was, we don't really want you to bring those people into our church. A couple people actually told me, we would rather not go to church here if those types of people came to our church. They, just like Jonah, didn't agree with God's policy of mercy for enemies. And it's not just other people. I mentioned I've also seen this in myself. I just got off of a very difficult stint as a youth pastor for kids that I liked less and less every time I met them. I would drive to church in the morning, this hour one-way drive, and just lament and think, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to spend 50 minutes just trying to preach the gospel to these kids, and I won't get a word in edgewise, and they will aggressively ignore me the whole time. And I would go, and I was right. And then I would drive home, and I would just stew about it and try and let go of this anger. And it just became easier for me emotionally to think, well, maybe what I'm doing is just preaching against them. So at the last day, God will say, see, I gave you somebody that told you the gospel. Like Jonah, I went up to the east of the city, not just thinking that they'd probably be destroyed, but rooting for it. And I had to pull that out of myself. That was difficult. Now, I had a good reason. I did. And these kids were awful. God had a reason to judge them. And I think this is what Jonah saw too. He and God had a great reason not to like the Ninevites. They later went on to enslave Israel. These were not nice people. But where Jonah went wrong and where I went wrong is that we didn't fully recognize that we serve a God who gives mercy to people who don't deserve it. He showed mercy to Jonah. He showed mercy to the Ninevites. He showed mercy to me. He showed mercy to you. He gave Jonah a very specific call. He said, go to Nineveh, for its trouble has come up before me, and preach to them. But in Matthew 28, we see that God has given the church a call to all nations. We as the church have been given a call to all people, for its trouble has risen up before God. That's who we've been sent to preach to. Now, we might have excellent reasons for not wanting to preach to our enemies, but we serve a God who loves them. So what God is saying to Jonah and what God says to us today is go to Nineveh, for its trouble is risen up before me.